Berlin in July 1944 felt both rigid and fragile. Boots met stone with practiced rhythm. Files moved through hands that did not shake in public. Formal greetings filled offices where curtains filtered a flat summer light. The war pressed on every conversation. Maps still showed lines of control, but certainty had thinned. Private doubts grew where official confidence once sat. Some officers began to weigh duty against survival. They spoke carefully and rarely. They relied on nods, pauses, and neutral phrases. They studied routines that might be turned to a different end. This program presents a speculative reconstruction based on public archives, wartime communiques, and later testimonies. It is not a definitive account. It draws from credible references and known timelines, yet it keeps a cautious distance from unverified claims. Names, titles, and specific instruments are limited by design. The tone remains measured and investigative. Where the record is unclear, we indicate possibility, not fact. Listeners should expect a calm progression through known settings, muted motivations, and a plan shaped by pressure. The story unfolds inside offices, mess rooms, and corridors. It moves along the constraints of military routine. Nothing here reaches beyond the era. Events remain within the season when calculation began to eclipse confidence. The first signs were almost invisible. A shift in a posture during a morning briefing, a pause before a salute, a comment about supply delays that carried more weight than its words. Berlin still looked orderly in July 1944. Trams kept their schedules. Courtyards were swept. The day opened with crisp greetings and the same worn steps to the same desks. Yet tension pressed in from every direction. Reports from the east described withdrawals that no message could disguise. The Western Front added new pressures that stretched planning across long days and longer nights. Inside this pressure, a small circle formed. They did not announce themselves. They did not move as a block. They were scattered across offices, departments, and units that valued process over personality. Each member learned to keep two faces. One met the public day. The other measured the shrinking space for error. They began with questions that did not sound like questions. Could routine be shaped into something else? Could an existing protocol written for unrest be redirected when the time came? They kept their ideas inside safe, simple sentences. Nothing direct. Nothing that would stand out if repeated by a careless colleague. Their caution was necessary. The system rewarded outward loyalty and punished ambiguity. Every desk had ears. Every telephone carried risk. Each signature needed careful thought. Over time, private doubts found alignment. Not complete agreement, but a workable center. Some hoped to save a state that felt near collapse. Others sought to remove the source they believed had led it to this edge. Many simply wanted the war to stop grinding men into the ground. They did not act from a single doctrine. They acted from converging fears. Their conversations were slow and flat by design. They relied on small verbal shields. They used familiar phrases. They repeated phrases that would not alarm a clerk who happened to pass a door. They tracked speeches, schedules, and travel habits, but never kept records in plain form. They studied how orders moved and how quickly. They studied who had authority to activate internal security plans and under what conditions. They studied what could be done inside accepted language. In this work, a thin chain of trust formed. It never felt strong. It relied on history, shared risk, and quiet tests. An officer would share a minor concern and watch the response. Another would offer a neutral observation about a recent communique and measure the silence that followed. The chain gained a new link only when patience and repetition made it safe. Two sources helped shape their picture. One was an administrative schedule that mapped meetings across departments. The other was a set of wartime minutes from planning sessions, thin on detail, but clear enough about who could issue certain orders. Neither source gave them certainty. Both gave them direction. They continued to draw near without closing the distance. Their circle would not stand out if sketched on a page. It appeared as faint marks around a center that none would name. Every day they walked through the same halls where portraits hung and flags were kept. Every day they mastered neutral faces, even as the air grew tighter. Each decision to continue felt like a decision to step onto thinner ice. They knew the risk of delay. They saw the cost of haste. They repeated this conflict each night, then woke and repeated it again. The summer advanced, and with it, the sense that time was shrinking. They prepared to shape a plan from the fabric of routine. They accepted that routine would also be their greatest threat if the first step fell short. The day closed with crisp farewells. Windows went dark. The city returned to a quieter hum. Inside a small set of apartments, men reviewed mental notes and burned nothing because nothing had been written. They agreed to meet again without fixing the words for that agreement. They agreed to move forward without speaking the word forward. They agreed that the next exchange would live inside the ordinary. The bridge to the next stage would be a meeting disguised as a meeting. The circle widened in small increments that felt almost accidental. A colleague received a remark about the pace of replacements and answered with a careful, measured phrase. Another observed that orders had become longer, as if length could cover loss, and chose not to smile. Each exchange was a test wrapped in normal speech. These men had learned to read posture and distance as much as language. A hand left on a folder a second too long could say more than a sentence. A long blink could end a conversation before it truly began. They developed an informal grammar. It included the places where open talk was least likely. Anterooms with constant foot traffic were avoided. Side corridors near file storage were favored because they allowed the slow drift of two officers away from a group. Stairwells were useful in late afternoon. Mess halls were usable only when noise rose high enough to mask careful words. Even then, a dropped utensil could force a pause. Letters were risky. Telephones were worse. They held to direct contact whenever possible. When distance forced written lines, they used phrases so plain that true meaning lived only in frame and timing. A request for clarification on an ordinary directive might restate a belief that the plan still had supporters. A brief note about a change in travel might carry a warning that surveillance had shifted. The reach of the circle grew like ink meeting dry paper. It spread along channels that already existed. It followed lines of duty. It did not move far beyond the world of staff and field liaison. It kept clear of anyone who looked too eager or too certain. Precision mattered more than speed. Two more sources started to guide them. One was a set of radio summaries that noted changes in staffing and temporary postings. Another was an internal announcement about an upcoming series of briefings on domestic order, stripped of details but clear about authority. These hints gave them shape but not a map. They adjusted slowly. They kept the plan in pieces. No one carried the full weight of knowledge. This arrangement felt safe but brought new problems. It made coordination hard. It made timing a matter of luck as much as design. Some nights they argued in low voices about scope. Should the circle open a little more? Should it hold at its current line? Each choice increased exposure. Each hesitation wore at morale. They tuned their approach to small, repeatable actions. A regular lunch at a predictable time, a brief walk to a courtyard step where a single sentence might be traded. A shared review of a harmless report that, in context, meant something else. They learned to show outward energy for official tasks while protecting their inner focus. Their families, neighbors, and clerks saw nothing unusual. The men slept less. Their faces thinned. Their routines held. The city gave them cover. It remained busy enough to blur movements. It remained stressed enough to explain tired eyes. The circle carried different motives. One man thought in terms of institutional preservation. Another held a private feeling that the war had crossed a moral line long ago. A third had no taste for philosophy and measured everything through risk tables in his head. The mix did not hinder them. It kept their center practical. They rarely spoke of outcomes beyond the first steps. They addressed means. They ranked barriers. They counted on trained habits to do the rest. Training, they believed, might carry instructions forward faster than suspicion could weaken them. Whether this hope was realistic remained unclear, yet it was the only lever they felt they could pull. Days passed with little visible change. The circle learned to treat patience as an action. They waited without stopping. They watched without freezing. They allowed the plan to keep its thin shape, even as pressure made it wobble. When a rumor of a security sweep spread, they paused and thinned contact. When the rumor faded, they resumed at the same calm pace. The work never accelerated enough to draw attention. It never dropped enough to die. Trust remained rationed. A single officer might be brought near the next layer through a shared complaint about confusing paperwork. Another might be tested by an invitation to review a harmless draft order. Each test had a soft edge. No test forced a declaration. Passing meant nothing more than another soft test later. Failing meant a polite retreat. Nothing visible broke, nothing obvious changed. And yet the ground under their feet did not feel the same. They had reached the moment when secrecy must accept a date. The next exchange would set that date, and a room in a quiet office would hold the discussion. The room chosen for the next step had familiar furniture and an ordinary view. Files sat in neat stacks. The window opened to a courtyard where staff crossed in pairs. The men entered at different times and left no marks in the registry. They spoke in plain language and kept their voices low. The goal was not a final design, but a workable draft that could ride on existing forms. They studied phrasing that could carry two meanings. It had to appear fully lawful to anyone reading in haste, yet it needed to point trained units in a different direction when the signal came. They reached for structure, already taught in schools and drilled in exercises. They tried to keep every term within the bounds of accepted use. They understood that one unfamiliar word could expose the plan to a clerk who did not even know he was looking for it. The men rehearsed how instructions traveled. A senior officer issued a directive. A staff office retyped it. Couriers distributed copies to commands. Each step took time. Each step added human judgment. If the plan was to work, it would need to move without friction inside a structure that had been built to resist surprise. The men accepted that no draft could remove chance. They aimed only to shorten the distance between decision and action. Two forms of documentation guided the discussion. The first was an archived notice that described who could sign under emergency conditions within the capital. The second was a summary of a wartime meeting that defined how regional offices should respond to civil unrest. None of these papers supported the plan openly. They simply sketched the corridors through which orders ran. The men followed those corridors on paper with pencils. They circled names. They drew arrows. Then they put the paper away and repeated the lines from memory. The city outside kept moving. The room stayed quiet. The draft grew sentence by sentence. It did not reach for dramatic effect. It borrowed the tone of ordinary control. It called for calm. It called for the maintenance of essential services. It called for protection of key sites. It offered nothing new and demanded nothing radical. The men believed this would help it pass unchallenged. Their real hope lay in the timing that would accompany the words. If released at the chosen moment, it might redirect garrisons without raising alarms until the movement could not be undone. The discussion then narrowed to names. Not too many and not too few. It needed men who would obey written orders that looked proper. It needed men who did not ask for voices on the telephone before acting. The first list was too long. The second was too short. They settled on a middle ground and left space for late additions if confidence grew. The hour lengthened. They reviewed risk. A copy might be seen by the wrong eyes. A courier might hesitate. A regional office might ask to confirm. These weak points could not be removed. They could only be covered by tempo and familiar language. The plan would need the strongest possible start. It would need a clear trigger. It would need the appearance of central direction across the city and beyond. The men marked the chosen day only in speech. No calendar entry, no note. They closed the meeting as they had begun it, with ordinary gestures and measured steps. In the following days, they polished the draft without leaving fingerprints. A turn of phrase shifted here or there. An instruction gained a clause that felt almost redundant. Redundancy, they believed, would help steady hands when pressure rose. Their faces betrayed little change. Their colleagues noted nothing out of place. Still, small tremors traveled through the circle. The knowledge of a date changed the air. It hardened the quiet bond that had held them together. It also introduced a fixed risk that could not be ignored. Surveillance might tighten without warning. A random inspection might open a file at an unlucky moment. There was no way to smooth these edges. The men accepted them as the price of movement. They made no speeches. They made no appeals. They let the calendar approach. The draft waited, folded inside routine tasks that would not excite a casual eye. On the final evening before the date, they checked their steps in silence. One reviewed a route. Another rehearsed a justification that sounded like duty. A third ran through the opening lines of an instruction as if it were a simple note about guard rotations. The circle did not gather to mark the decision. They remained in their separate rooms with their separate thoughts, bound by the same plan. Night covered the city and brought no rest. Before dawn, the men rose into the same uniforms and the same greetings, carrying a decision that looked like a normal day from the outside. The next scene would open in a different place, where a scheduled meeting could fix the moment for release. The previous decision moved the circle toward a rural complex where gravel paths met dense trees and wooden buildings held a steady, controlled quiet. The morning air felt close. Guards checked papers with a method that offered no warmth. Vehicles unloaded staff who walked at a measured pace that matched the rhythm of the war calendar. Inside, the formalities of a scheduled briefing held. Uniforms were neat. Voices stayed controlled. Punctuality felt like a ritual that protected fragile order. The briefing room was long and spare, with a narrow table set for a focused exchange. Windows were tall but offered little breeze. The conversation opened with standard reports on the state of the fronts. Numbers were recited in voices that did not rise. The space carried the smell of paper and dust. A senior figure, long accustomed to command, stood near a mapboard that showed lines shifting under pressure. Those present watched faces as much as figures. A small case rested near a chair, unremarkable, amid folders and habitual clutter. Men adjusted their positions as others entered. A late change of room altered spacing and forced tighter proximity. The circle's chosen trigger now depended on timing, placement, and silence. The weather added heat to a room not built for comfort. A draft of air cut across the floor when the door opened. The senior figure moved between map and table in practiced arcs. Conversation tightened around rail movements, reinforcement timetables, and the strain on supply corridors. Every pause felt longer than it was. A watch ticked at a steady beat. No one seemed willing to raise a voice, even for clarity. In another building, telephones connected and disconnected as staff confirmed later agendas. Couriers stood by without urgency. The day had been scheduled to maintain shape. The circle counted on that shape to hold long enough for a signal to move. Then a violent rupture tore through the room. It came not as a dramatic warning, but as an instant shift from order to shock. Sound hit walls. Heat and pressure rolled outward. The table buckled. Windows blew away from their frames. Dust filled lungs and choked language. Bodies fell or stumbled. In the first seconds, no one spoke with purpose. Training took over. Some dragged others into the light. Others rushed toward the corridor. The senior figure disappeared into the haze and then reappeared, moving under instinct and reflex. A guard shouted. Another answered. The compound lurched from routine to alarm. A field medic arrived and waved men to clear space. The smell of char and timber replaced paper and dust. Reports began to form but lacked sequence. The first message that traveled outward carried more confusion than detail. Inside that confusion, the circle in the capital waited for a prearranged phrase. The phrase did not name causes. It only stated a condition that would justify the release of orders for domestic control. In the complex, officers tried to count who stood and who did not. They failed to fix a complete list. Gaps in the record opened at once. The absence of clarity turned into fragments. A figure with authority issued instructions to secure the area and lock movement. Runners moved to gates. A perimeter tightened. The leader's fate remained unclear for minutes that felt much longer. Staff officers trained to manage crises attempted to reimpose procedure. The act of reimposing procedure created a signal that traveled faster than complete facts. In the capital, the phrase arrived. It was delivered by a channel that had been deemed adequate. The circle interpreted it as confirmation that the condition had been met. They did not wait for second sources. They judged that delay would erase their narrow chance. While the compound shifted from shock to controlled activity, the capital began to shift from waiting to action. The path now forked. One path moved from the complex outward, seeking to reassert central presence. The other moved from the capital inward, seeking to claim central direction under a lawful cover. The gap between these paths widened with each minute of uncertainty. The men at the complex pressed toward clarity. They inventoried injuries, stabilized the wounded, and attempted a first narrative. The men in the capital pressed toward Tempo. They moved to their prepared desks, opened drawers that contained folded drafts, and prepared to release language that would pull units into alignment. The air in both places felt thin. Watches were checked again and again. The next action would lift the plan out of protective ambiguity and into the visible world, where timing and interpretation could either reinforce or weaken each other. The next scene would unfold inside offices that could send paper faster than certainty. The Capitol headquarters felt both familiar and exposed as the first message reached the circle. The phrase they had agreed upon was present. Its tone matched the conditions spelled out in their draft. The men did not hold a vote. They moved directly to execution. A senior officer took his place behind a large desk and adopted a voice that carried institutional weight. Clerks were summoned without ceremony. Typewriters began to strike a steady rhythm. The first directive called for immediate measures to protect key facilities. It used language that matched established doctrine and avoided any hint of novelty. The second directive identified a chain of acting authority and anchored it in known statutes. Nothing appeared outside the usual kit of administrative action. The men chose channels that could not be ignored. Couriers lifted sealed envelopes and moved toward waiting vehicles. A separate set of messages traveled by machine to regional commands. Telephones rang at district posts. The opening lines were calm and almost banal. They referenced the need to maintain order during a grave situation. The recipients, trained to act without delay, began to move. Some formed cordons near ministries. Others visited broadcasting offices and transport hubs. The city shifted into a posture of restraint. Most citizens did not notice the initial change. Trams still ran. Shops still opened. The weight of the day sat mainly on uniforms. The plan depended on momentum. It needed units to accept orders at face value and to act before they asked to confirm. For a critical hour, this seemed feasible. A few district heads accepted the directives and reported compliance. They referenced the authority cited in the text. This early obedience encouraged the circle. They pushed the second wave of instructions, which expanded protective measures and redirected a limited number of units toward strategic intersections. Moments of friction appeared at once. A cautious officer asked for a voice confirmation. Another requested the name of the originating signatory. These were reasonable questions from trained subordinates. Their timing threatened the plan because the complex in the east was rapidly recovering from shock. The circle held to their script. They repeated the lawful wording and cited the emergency clause. Some calls were satisfied by the repetition. Others were not. In a few offices, staff put the directive beside a current bulletin and found small mismatches in phrasing. The mismatches were not fatal. They were enough to slow movement. The plan had counted on Tempo to outrun scrutiny. Scrutiny began to gain. 2 documentary hints helped the circle maintain confidence. One was a brief contemporaneous bulletin noting an incident at the field headquarters. The other was a short internal circular that mentioned temporary communications disruptions in the East. Neither document granted legal control. Both suggested that their reading of events remained plausible. The men used these hints to steady nerves while they pushed a broader cordon across central districts. The sight of additional uniforms at keynotes created a sense of official calm. It also sparked questions from offices that had not received instructions from their usual channels. Downtime turned into telephone traffic. The network heated up. Within the headquarters complex, a separate group that was not aligned with the circle began to notice the pattern. They did not yet have complete facts. They had enough to call trusted counterparts across town. Those counterparts began to ask sharper questions. Who had authority to issue the latest orders? Which bureau had retyped the directives? Where was the central figure whose name normally anchored such measures? The circle answered with careful phrases that sounded right but avoided specifics. They believed that a few more minutes of movement could lock the plan in place. They leaned on the power of obedience to written text. They set an announcement for later in the day that would define the situation in authoritative terms. The clock refused to slow. News from the field headquarters arrived in delayed fragments. The fragments suggested survival where the circle had expected finality. These reports were not yet official. They were strong enough to seep into offices that held real leverage. A senior loyalist reappeared in the Capitol apparatus and began to place countercalls. Those calls carried the confidence of long habit and direct ties. The tone on the lines changed. Subordinates who had started to move under the Circle's instructions began to drift toward neutrality. Some stopped. Others waited for a fresh signature. The Circle felt the air shift. They tried to regain tempo with one more wave of precise, lawful language. It reached fewer hands in time. Confusion deepened. The bridge to the next scene formed when a senior messenger arrived with a confirmation from the East that could not be shaped by careful wording and forced the Circle to confront a new balance of control. The document delivered to the Capitol headquarters landed with the weight of an anvil applied quietly. It was a simple report, orderly and short, stating that the central figure had survived the blast and was managing the response. No rhetoric sat inside the lines. The effect was immediate. The network of officers who had delayed action while requesting confirmation shifted in an instant. Units that had taken positions under the earlier directives asked for new instructions. The Circle looked at one another and understood that the narrow window had begun to close. They attempted a final consolidation. They sent orders to hold positions and maintain calm. They stressed continuity over change and claimed that stabilization was the purpose all along. The language remained lawful. The tone remained steady. The city sensed the conflict without a clear frame for it. Extra checkpoints lingered. Couriers moved faster. Doors opened and closed at ministries that usually kept predictable hours. By late afternoon, a loyalist corps inside the Capitol's apparatus had the confidence to push counter orders with clarity and force. Their messages named offices by title and asserted direct authority from the surviving center. They were brief. They asked for compliance and reporting. These lines traveled fast because they fit existing expectations. The Circle watched phone lines light up, then go quiet. The quiet did not signal acceptance. It signaled that recipients had chosen a side. The headquarters that had been the Circle's engine now faced visitors who spoke with the gravity of restored continuity. The men still attempted to frame their actions as a measured response to a confused morning. They presented the earlier measures as protective steps that had safeguarded the Capitol. The visitors listened without expressions. They asked to see the drafts that had been used. They inspected signatures and routing notes. They requested a list of intermediaries. The Circle managed these requests with calm that felt strained at the edges. Outside, patrols rotated in a way that indicated substitution. Familiar faces withdrew from key posts and were replaced by men known to be cautious and loyal. The turnover did not provoke confrontation. It produced a slow, inevitable compression. Isolated departments began to report that they had reconnected with the field headquarters and received fresh guidance. Radios carried short announcements that emphasized continuity and control. A few officers who had quietly supported the Circle earlier in the day walked back their positions. They did not denounce anyone. They presented their choices as the product of incomplete information that had now been corrected. The Circle could not dispute the claim without exposing the secrecy that defined their effort. By evening, the headquarters felt smaller. Rooms that had been open now required permission. Officers who had moved with brisk certainty in the morning now moved carefully, aware that their steps were watched. Requests for interviews arrived with the tones of polite insistence. The Circle's confidence rested on a thin hope that a public framing might still recast the day as a lawful emergency measure. That hope narrowed as accounts from the field headquarters grew more detailed and more direct. The surviving center began to speak in a single voice again. The city responded to that voice because it had always held the strongest weight. Within offices, drawers closed on materials that had carried risk. Some papers were burned. Others were hidden in places where discovery would be a matter of luck. The men avoided eye contact in corridors, not from shame but from a practical need to avoid recordable signals. They had moved for reasons that did not fit into a single sentence. They knew those reasons had little value now. The procedure that followed did not rush. It was deliberate and careful, designed to document and isolate. Questions were asked in a style that denied drama. Notes were taken. Names were confirmed. Doors closed. The city's night pressed against windows. The last pieces of the plan faded as telephone lines fell still and vehicles relocated to established posts. The arrests began without spectacle. A car stopped at a corner. An officer stepped inside. A light remained on in a stairwell until the bulb warmed and dimmed. A family heard footsteps and then quiet. The circle dissolved not in a clash, but in a sequence of private acknowledgments that the ground had given way. Inside secure rooms, a ledger of the day formed. It recorded times, movements, and signatures. It left out much of what mattered, but it gave the apparatus what it needed to move forward. The men who had tried to shape the day into a different pattern did not write their own closing notes. Their faces appeared in lines of text that did not carry their voices. By midnight, the headquarters had returned to standardized silence, broken only by the routine steps of guards along polished floors. The next movement of this story would shift to hearings and statement rooms, where the language of loyalty, duty, and survival would be weighed within narrow frames that belonged to the era alone. The day's rush cooled into a strict, deliberate quiet. Buildings returned to familiar rhythms. Guards resumed patterned turns and exchanged nods that revealed nothing. A record of the crisis entered files in clean, compact lines. It did not share the hesitation that had marked the hours. It did not share the small human calculations that filled hallways and anterooms. It showed times, signatures, and short phrases. It mentioned the survival of the center and the restoration of procedure. It spoke of order without acknowledging its fragile edge. The circle that had moved against momentum now existed mostly as a list of actions, not a living chain of doubts and hopes. Their reasons would survive only in fragments, shaped by testimonies and the summaries of those who collected them. Two sources may help a later reader approach the edges of this day. One is a set of administrative minutes that catalog the sequence of directives. Another is a short series of radio bulletins that track the return of central voice. Neither source captures intent. Both capture tempo and range. The city slept under a careful calm, pretending the day had been contained. Inside a few rooms, lights stayed on as interrogations stretched past midnight. Questions followed protocol. Answers stayed narrow. Phrases were repeated until they lost any private meaning. The story remains open at the margins where memory, duty, and risk meet. And the next chapter turns to the rooms where statements were taken, signatures were gathered, and official narratives settled, while personal narratives folded inward. What remains unspoken in those rooms, and what survived inside men who returned to their posts, will shape the tone of the hours that follow and the documents that would soon define the era for anyone who came after.